putting it into action, navigating conflict, and managing stress to build resiliency. My name is Laura Simons, the TKI Product Marketing Manager here at CPP, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. If any of you are new to us, CPP is the exclusive publisher of the Myers-Briggs assessment as well as other assessments, such as the Thomas-Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, the TKI, which are used by organizations and professionals around the world to improve people performance. In our April 26th webinar on managing conflict under stress, Drs. Ralph Kilman and Sarita Bakuni presented how conflict and stress can impact the individual, the team, and the entire organization. In today's webinar, our speakers will present 10 actionable tips for using both the MBTI and TKI assessments in training or coaching with your clients. Today's webinar will run approximately 1 hour, with the last 15 minutes reserved for questions and answers. If you have a question, please submit it via the questions box located on the right side of your screen. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we will address as many as possible during the allotted time. As with all our webinars, today's is being recorded, and we'll send out a link to the recording in just a few days, as well as a copy of these presentation slides. And we will post the recording to our website, www.cpp.com. So, today's speakers are first Michael Segovia, and then followed by Dr. Kenneth Thomas. Michael is a well-known MBTI expert and is CPP's MBTI certification trainer. He has extensive experience facilitating workshops on 5 continents on several assessments, such as the MBTI, the FIRO-B, and the Strong Interest Inventory. He also has a master's degree in clinical psychology. Michael, welcome. I'd like to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think we can all agree that stress is everywhere. I work with companies practically in every industry, and I see it pretty much every day. You can see on screen that the American Institute of Stress states that stress costs U.S. businesses so much. So in the previous webinar on stress, Ralph Kilman and Sarita Bakuni addressed several issues. They looked at the presence of the inferior function and how it informs how we choose which conflict mode we use, how to access the appropriate mode for whichever situation we're dealing with, the goal of getting back to our dominant function and the natural way of approaching ourselves and others, our level of presence and how we pay attention to clues which determine how we notice if our inferior function is activated, and the idea of moving from fight, flight, or freeze to action. What we're going to look at today is just continuing that topic by first looking at how to use the MBTI tool to help individuals manage stress and build resiliency. So when it comes to personality type and the MBTI tool, I've learned to focus on what we call the 8 dominant functions. And by the dominant function, what I'm talking about is really the heart of each type. It tends to be the source of our motivation and energy, and really the main reason why we do the things we do. So for those of you new to type dynamics, I'll briefly update you. However, I would suggest taking a look at a few CPP publications like Introduction to Type Dynamics and Development, and Introduction to Type and Change, among many others. So I'm going to give you a simple word to remember each dominant function, keeping in mind that when we're having a good day, that this is what it's going to look like. So when we look at ESTP and ESFP, the dominant function is what we call extroverted sensing. And those of you listening who have been part of the MBTI certification programs I facilitate will know that I use the word experiencing to describe extroverted sensing. And by experiencing, what we mean is, for extroverted sensing, is they see the world in the here and now. You can watch someone, for example, who uses extroverted sensing drive down the street, and they're going to look around and see things in a very present moment, and they're going to really remember a lot of what they saw. That's really how I would describe extroverted sensing. Then we get to introverted sensing, and the word I like to use is remembering. And by remembering, what I mean is those people who use introverted sensing in their dominant function, and even in their auxiliary function, their second favorite, they tend to remember details of things that are interesting to them. So you might ask them about something from their childhood that was interesting to them, and their level of detail will be astounding. It's amazing. They can remember specific facts, specific details, all sorts of things like that. That's really how we would define introverted sensing. Then we get to extroverted intuition, and you see ENTP and ENFP are the two types that use extroverted intuition as their dominant function. The word I like to use for extroverted intuition is brainstorming. They brainstorm with others, and they use language like what if or how about whenever they start sentences. You've seen them in meetings all the time. They have lots of big picture thinking, big picture ideas. Then we get to introverted intuition, and the word I like to use for introverted intuition is visioning. They tend to see the world in sort of a future-focused way. They tend to, in some ways, it looks like they're predicting the future. And by the future, I mean 2, 5, 10 years into the future. That's what introverted intuition is about. Then we get to extroverted thinking, and the word I like to use is organizing. In a way, it's putting things into place. And it could even mean telling people what to do. That's often what you're going to see with extroverted thinking. Then we go to introverted thinking, and the word I like to use is analyzing. It's sort of like this mind map that they set up inside their brain about some topic or some idea, and they set up this internal analysis around it. The next word we see is extroverted feeling. And the word I like to use is harmonizing. It's really about how does everybody feel? So when it comes to making a decision using extroverted feeling for the ENFJ and ESFJ, they really think about how will this decision affect people? How does everybody feel around that decision? And then finally, the word for introverted feeling I like to use is valuing. For people who use introverted feeling in their dominant function, you'll see the INFP and the ISFP. It's about these inner set or inner core of values that they live by. And you won't often know about those values until, of course, they're stepped on, and then you'll definitely know that you stepped on the value. So just some simple words to remember to think about for each of the dominant functions. And again, we have 8 dominant functions. So I'm going to move us forward and just think about what happens under stress. And you'll see the title of this slide is Type Exaggeration, because that's really what we're looking at. At first, the dominant function takes over, since it's what we know best about ourselves. And during initial stress, we tend to overuse it because it's what's most comfortable for us. The result is we end up using it like a crutch. And in essence, we overuse it, and we start to look very much like a limited version of our type. Some might even say a very closed-minded version of that type. So let's look at what it can look like for each type when we exaggerate our dominant function. So for extroverted sensing, ESTP and ESFP, it can look like things like the sky is falling, and where they start to pay attention to details that previously were totally unimportant, and now those details are the only things that matter. For introverted sensing, they say things like, these are the only facts, and they go by the book and by the book only. It can look a bit rigid for those of us who use introverted sensing when we start to exaggerate it. For extroverted intuition, it's this flurry of activity and this word we call awfulizing, where they start to even imagine things like noticing some spot on their arm and thinking, oh my God, I'm dying. That's what it can look like when we exaggerate extroverted intuition. And then for introverted intuition, where they have so many ideas and there's this desperate need to find a pattern, even if a pattern doesn't exist. So those are what we call the perceiving functions: extroverted sensing, introverted sensing, extroverted intuition, and introverted intuition. Now, I know this might be advanced for some people, but again, we cover this quite a bit in the MBTI certification program, and I will mention a few resources that you can look at that will help you understand this further. One of them is an excellent booklet called Introduction to Type Dynamics and Development. So let's continue now with the judging functions. And you'll see extroverted thinking, that's ESTJ and ENTJ. Basically, you'll hear language like, this is what we're going to do, and there'll often be an exclamation mark at the end of that statement. This is where they become drill sergeants and can be a bit bossy, if you will, when they exaggerate extroverted thinking. Introverted thinking, ISTP and INTP, where they start to tell themselves and look at other people and say to themselves, everyone else is incompetent, where they become overly critical. And you might not hear them say it, but if you look at their face, you'll definitely see it on their faces. Then we get to extroverted feeling. That's where we see the ENFJ and the ESFJ. And this is where they say things like, I know what you need. And they have this stance of overbearing care. Or they might go up to you and ask how you're doing, and you might say, I'm perfectly fine. And they might say, well, I don't think so. I really think you need this. Or here's a blanket. Or here's some tea. Where it's this overbearing care that you might not even need. And then finally, we get to introverted feeling. And again, it goes back to values for introverted feeling. But when they exaggerate it, their values only count, where they become a martyr and they can sort of delve in this pool of self-pity, this woe is me type of mentality. So that's what it looks like when we exaggerate our dominant function. Now let's look at what happens when that stress grows. So you'll see as stress grows and is unresolved, in an effort to get things back into balance, what happens is the inferior function can take over. And because we don't often use our inferior function, we often don't use it well, resulting in behavior that's very much not like the person we normally are. And you can see it on screen, the picture of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which kind of makes me laugh because I've definitely been there myself. So let's look at this. It's going to be different by type. So let's start with ESTP and ESFP, where you see the dominant function is extroverted sensing and the inferior function is introverted intuition. Basically, the inferior function is the opposite in every way of the dominant function. So for ESTP and ESFP, they can imagine disasters and dire possibilities and tend to misinterpret events and comments. So they might take things personally because of that misinterpretation. For ISTJ and ISFP, you see the dominant function is introverted sensing, the inferior function is extroverted intuition. This is where they catastrophize and lose control of facts and details, where normally those facts and details would be very sort of aware for them. They'd be very much in control of those. Then we get to ENTP and ENFP. They become obsessive about facts or details, and they tend to withdraw. Again, very different from the people they normally are. And then the last bullet on this slide, INTJ and INFJ, where they overindulge in sensory activities like eating, maybe even things like cleaning, and become hypersensitive to facts and details and comments. Now, these are from an excellent booklet titled In the Grip by Naomi Klein, and I'm only touching on these topics, and I'm going to show you that resource in just a bit, but I would recommend for those of you interested in exploring this deeper, you want to take a look at some of that. Let's go continue. We will continue. We're going to look at ESTJ and ENTJ, where they become overly sensitive to inner feelings and become overly focused on inner values. Again, very different from the people they normally are. For ISTP and INTP, they become hypersensitive to signs that they are unloved or disliked, feel distressed at not being accepted. For ESFJ and ENFJ, they become excessively critical of self and others and apply convoluted logic to things that normally they don't typically apply things that way. And then finally, ISFP and INFP, they become overly critical and harsh, lose confidence and sense of competence. Now, I haven't shared this with you, but I have preferences for INFP. So this last one is me, and I can definitely say that I've been there during times of extreme stress, and people who know me well would even give examples of this. And so what I want to challenge you all to do, all of you listening, you might read this and say, this has never happened to me. And that could be true. But ask people who know you very well, and I would guess that they would likely say things like, yeah, remember when our flight was canceled on our trip to Hawaii, how you behaved? It might even be an example that you're reading here today. So let's look at some action steps that can help us deal with all of this, because it's important to know this information, but then what do you do? So I'm going to share with you several action steps, starting with some information first about the resources that I've covered. So you'll see I'm using the booklet In the Grip. I've already mentioned that. I'm also going to mention our new report we have called the MBTI Stress Management Report. So I suggest you take a closer look at each of these, and we can give you some information about those in just a bit. So action step 1. When an individual is in the grip, consider the dynamics at play, and by that I mean the type dynamics at play, and look for ways to help the individual return to their natural type. The practitioner tip here is to ask questions that require the individual to take action that will help the stressed personality state, remembering that the questions will be different based on the person's type. So you have to keep in mind those differences. You can't treat everybody the same because we are different. So let's see what these are going to look like on each of the next slides. All right, so let's go to ESTP and ESFP. What you want to do there is encourage them to explore contingency plans for stressful situations and then help them prioritize practical solutions. So what we're doing here is using their inferior function to help them get a grip, if you will, and then access their dominant function to move out of the grip. That's what each of these recommendations is doing. When we get to ISTJ and ISFJ, we allow them to play out their worries to completion. You let them vent and connect the situation to past experiences. So again, looking at their inferior function, but helping their dominant function to help them get out of the grip. Then we get to ENTP and ENFP. You help them remember some of the practical details and then encourage reflection time to brainstorm. Then we're at INTJ and INFJ. You suggest they take some time to consider the long-range impact and give them a break from their workload. So again, the booklet in the grip covers a lot more than what I'm covering with us today, and I do recommend that you take a look at that. We're going to continue with action step 1 by looking at ESTJ and ENTJ. You want to encourage them to just let it out and feel what they're feeling, and then find a trusted friend to help them problem solve. It needs to be someone they trust, though, so make sure that's the case. We get to ISTP and INTP, and you want to honor and acknowledge their feelings. Then respect their privacy, give them time away so that they have that time to think about what they want to, how they want to resolve that situation. Don't force them to sit and talk with you about it. You get to ESFJ and ENFJ. You can be a sounding board for their criticism, but again, help them find a trusted person, trusted others for support. And then we get to ISFP and INFP. You want to give them time to work it out. Give them time to work it and then help validate their feelings. Don't tell them that their feelings don't mean anything. That's not going to help. So that's action step 1. Let's look at action step 2. These are basically about what we want to avoid, how to avoid behaviors that will increase stress levels and promote a sustained grip response. The practitioner tip here is be prepared with an understanding of what actions will cause additional stress. Basically, don't make it worse. So let's look at what not to do next. We get to ESTP and ESFP. You don't want to fuel the fire of their worries. You don't want to sit there and say, I know, that's really bad, isn't it? Don't fuel the fire. It's not going to help the situation. For ISTJ and ISFJ, don't tell them that they're being irrational. We've seen those situations where you tell someone that and you see the situation now has doubled. It's worse for them. For the ENTP and the ENFP, don't try to solve their problem and certainly don't patronize. And then for INTJ and INFJ, basically don't give advice and don't give suggestions. Give them time to work it out. We continue with action step 2, and we see ESTJ and ENTJ don't intrude by trying to solve things for them. Let them solve it their own way. For ISTP and INTP, don't invade their space by asking them how they feel. For ESFJ and ENFJ, don't push them to talk it out. Let them have their own time to do that. And then for ISFP and INFP, don't try to reason with them. Don't try to calm them down. Let them sort of have that period of venting. And then in a period of time, they'll definitely feel better about it in a period of time. All right, action step 3. Moving forward, I know relatively quickly we have a lot to cover, but action step 3 is about helping individuals become aware of circumstances or events that are likely to trigger the stress reaction. What would cause them stress? So your tip here is continue to use the MBTI stress management report as a way to facilitate their discussion. And if you've seen on screen, I've shown a few pages from that report. You can see a free sample of this report, and we'll show you how to look at that in just a bit. Action step 4, identify the most and least effective ways for dealing with stress and GRIP responses. And the tip here is to highlight sections in the report that are most relevant for their client. It's really about helping them focus on specific areas that relate to his or her type. And I like to have clients use a yellow highlighter and a pink highlighter, and that's how they help focus on parts of the report that are most important to them. In yellow, parts that really resonate with them. These are areas they want to focus on. And in pink, areas that aren't as important to them, but definitely areas they can still read at a later time. So you don't want them to cross out anything at all on the report. And then we get to action step 5, create plans for garnering support in the future by identifying the most and least helpful ways others can react. So the practitioner tip here is you assign parts of the report to your client as homework, being careful not to assign too much of the report at one time, because you know what happens. You give someone everything and then they don't do anything. So together you go through the report with them, they identify the most important parts, and that's what they work with. Basically, dealing with stress is not a one-session approach. You need to give your client homework and then schedule follow-up sessions for progress reports, making sure to add new homework each time. Well, that's it for me today. I hope you found a few things that you can work with, and thanks again for listening. I'm going to pass things over to Laura. Thanks again.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we have Dr. Kenneth Thomas. As a researcher, author, and professor, Ken has an extensive background in business and management. He has authored a variety of publications, assessments, books, and articles with the Thomas-Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, the TKI, among the most popular. Ken has been on the faculties of the Naval Postgraduate School, UCLA, Temple University, and the University of Pittsburgh. He is also an in-demand speaker, having presented at conventions and meetings in the U.S., Europe, and Asia. Now, let me turn the presentation over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Laura. Let's see, the last webinar, the thought webinar, Ralph Kilman did a nice job of talking about how he could control his own stress to make better choices among the conflict handling modes. In this action webinar, on the other hand, I'm going to go a little farther down in the weeds to give you some idea about how you or your clients can use each mode constructively, skills, issues, things to look out for, and so on, so that you don't create unnecessary stress. So here's an overview of what I'm going to be doing in my session. To give you a brief overview of the TKI tool and some support booklets that go along with it, especially for some of you who maybe aren't as familiar with the TKI as you might be. And then we're going to get into 5 action kind of skills or steps that relate to specific kinds of skills. Clarifying motives, some temptations for each mode style that they'll want to resist, some key skills for implementing each of the 5 conflict handling modes. And then I'm going to direct your attention specifically to collaboration as a sort of special case that deserves special attention. And we're going to spend a little time on collaborative skill building for individuals and how to build collaborative capacity into teams. Next slide. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the TKI, this is what it measures. There are 5 conflict handling modes that are identified according to their level of assertiveness and their level of cooperativeness. And so these are the basic 5 options people have in a conflict situation. Competing is assertive and uncooperative. It involves pushing your own concerns at the expense of the other person. Accommodating is the opposite of that. It's cooperative and unassertive. Sacrifice your own concern in favor of the other person's, and so on. And especially when I direct your attention to collaborating in the upper right-hand corner, it is a way of being both assertive and cooperative, and it involves problem solving to try to find win-win solutions that completely satisfy concerns of the 2 people involved. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the TKI basically it focuses on when to use these different conflict handling modes. So it introduces the 5 conflict handling modes. It helps clients identify the modes that they use most frequently, that is their conflict style. It provides a list of situations when each of those modes is especially helpful. So very much it views all these 5 modes as important tools to have in your toolkit, but it directs you to use the specific tools for the situations that they best fit. And encourages clients to choose their conflict modes thoughtfully rather than out of habit, so you recognize the greater range of choices you have and use them thoughtfully. And it provides some warning signals of overuse or underuse for each mode. So that's what actually you encounter in the TKI booklet itself. And we've also developed a couple of support booklets that go with the TKI, and they provide guidance on how to use each mode constructively. So here we're getting at specific skills and things to do and things not to do. Introduction to Conflict Management provides skill building for individuals. It's intended for management, supervisory training, and coaching. It's a nice takeaway from executive programs and so on. It's focused at the individual level. The other booklet, Introduction to Conflict in Teams, is focused at the team level. It provides guidance for being a team member in a team context, as well as advice on team-level concerns, how to be effective as an entire team, and so on. So what I'm going to be doing today is basically sampling about 5 ideas from these 2 booklets and deriving some action implications or steps from those, with the hope that that'll help take your use of the TKI to the next level. Okay, slide. So I've got 5 insights and related action steps that I'm going to cover for you in a brief time, with the knowledge that you probably won't have enough time to grasp each one fully. So I'm going to urge you to take a look at these 2 booklets that I mentioned before after the webinar, share them with your staff, and see how you could incorporate those ideas into your own training or coaching or consulting interventions. Next. Okay, so the first insight is that motives often get misread. It happens a lot with competitors, for example. So here's an example of a competitor and an accommodator and the views they have of each other. And what typically happens is the team members stereotype other styles at their worst, that is, framing them negatively in terms of their own values. So we've got the competitor who values strength and being a champion for a cause and so on, as seeing the accommodator as nicey nice, losing out, being timid, not standing up and pushing for something the way the competitor would. The other end, we see the accommodator seeing the competitor as insensitive, selfish, and bullying, rather than looking out for others, their welfare, and group feeling, as the accommodator would, and so on. Now, the danger of this is that it generates resentment, and it also makes it difficult to talk to the other person about their behavior in ways that aren't antagonizing. And it's hard for the competitor to say to the accommodator, stop being so timid, without antagonizing the accommodator, or for the accommodator to say, please don't be so bullying, without offending the competitor. So what we find is a very helpful intervention in a group sitting situation is to point out the actual positive intentions behind the conflict handling modes. Next slide. So here are a list of the positive intentions and some of the sort of typical comments or the thinking behind these conflict modes or the styles of people who typically do these 5 conflict handling modes. So the competitor is basically a champion, and he or she is saying, here's a good thing to do. Let's move it ahead. Let's make something good happen for the group. collaborator is a problem solver, saying, wait, can we find a win-win solution here? The compromiser is the pragmatist. Said, should we settle for a workable middle ground? You've got the avoider, who is essentially a timekeeper. Is this issue worth our time? Because if it's not, I don't want to get involved. And the accommodator, I use the word chaplain here. Person is concerned with individual goodwill and the goodwill in the group and the well-being of the people in the group. Actually has more focus on taking care of those people than in terms of protecting his own concerns and so on. Now notice that these are all very positive motives and that each of them makes a contribution to group functioning. You need champions, you need problem solvers, you need pragmatists, you need timekeepers, and you need the chaplain. So what we find is that if you make these positive motives apparent to people, it changes the dynamics. It becomes easy to talk to the other person about what they're doing. So instead of saying to a competitor, stop bullying, you say, I understand that you think this is a good thing to do, but maybe we could find a better win-win solution, for example. Or if you're talking to the avoider, you can, instead of saying that you're meek or don't care or whatever, you say, I understand that you're concerned about the time, but this is clearly an important issue for a group, so I think it's worth our time. Anyway, it provides a more constructive way of having those kinds of conversations that aren't based on a misinterpretation of motives. Next slide. So action step one that comes from this business about misinterpreting motives is you want to address the positive motives of the conflict styles in your group. Practitioner tip, it's a powerful intervention in conflict interventions or as a part of team building. I find that it's especially helpful for avoiders, competitors, and accommodators who often get stereotyped in negative ways. And I also suggest that when you do this with a group, that you provide examples of how to appeal to those positive motives during a conflict. That use the kind of comments that I mentioned earlier. Okay, next. Okay, here's the second insight, and that is that each of the 5 conflict styles comes with certain temptations that need to be resisted. This is just a partial list. Look at the Introduction to Conflict in Teams if you want to get a full list, so on. Let's look at a couple. We don't have time for all of them. I am going to talk about the collaborative skills a little later, and temptations and so on, but I'll talk more about collaboration. But at the moment, let's look at these temptations for competing. Laura, let's look at that slide. Okay, so competitors will be familiar with this. Not listening, interrupting, talking over other people, ignoring other statements, attacking, showing anger, making personal criticism or threats. These are the kinds of behaviors that add distress in a group, make teammates roll their eyes, and yet the person doing it may not be aware of the cost and may even be rationalizing something like, well, you've got to break a few eggs to make an omelet and so on. The truth is you don't need to if you're doing these things skillfully and so on. So there are a set of temptations for the competitive resist. Let's look at accommodator now. Accommodators have very different. They're less assertive, but they also have some temptations that cause frustrations for their teammates. And they allow questionable decisions by not challenging decisions they have doubts about, not rocking the boat. They may bend rules or allow exceptions to rules or standards and overlook violations or substandard performance out of concern for other people and their welfare. So there's just a sample of these temptations to resist, and in fact there's quite a long list in the booklet. Next slide. So one action step involving these temptation behaviors is that you want to point out the cost of these temptation behaviors if you're dealing with a group or coaching an individual. Practitioner tip, have style groups. By style groups, I'm talking about something that if you use the TKI, the chances are that you normally do this anyway. One of the most engaging things you can do when you deal with the TKI is put people into groups based on their dominant styles and have them talk about the contributions of their style. And the thing comes alive. People get very excited. They're with people who are like-minded and so on. As you have them talking about their contributions, also make sure that they talk about their temptations as well and the need to resist those temptations. I also find that executive coaches and team leaders need to provide continuing feedback when they see those behaviors. It's not enough just to sort of bring it up once, obviously. You've got to kind of keep on that. All right, next slide. Okay. The third insight here is that there are key skills involved in each of the conflict handling modes, and that you probably want to deal with some of those skills in the workshop. It's not enough just to say, you want to be using these modes in these situations. Some people will find that they don't know how to use those modes very well. And so we've got here, this is a very partial list. There are about 5 for each conflict handling mode that are listed in the booklets and so on. I'm going to be talking about firm flexibility and identifying underlying concerns, or these collaborative skills, a little later, so I won't mention them here. But you'll see that for competitors, for example, it's important for them to learn to fight fair, to use warnings instead of threats. For avoiders, for example, lower left-hand corner there, you'll notice that it's important to be able to avoid without being evasive. That's not just a semantic difference. There are ways of doing that. And they want to avoid personalized conflicts, so there's information, there's skills about breaking the anger cycle and so on. And likewise for the other 5 conflict handling modes. Next slide. Okay, so the third action step is about using these kind of skill building activities, addressing these skills, identifying them for people who may need them, and giving them time to practice them. Again, going beyond when to use the 5 conflict handling modes, which is the emphasis of the TKI, and giving them skills on how to do it. So practitioner tip, you can pick skills in one of several ways. For example, coaches can select the skills that are most needed for the client's personal development. A change agent can select skills most needed for the team's functioning, or a trainer can simply assign introduction to conflict management and have clients pick the skills they find most interesting to practice. And very often, those will be skill building in not their dominant mode, but the ones that they use less frequently. And very often, clients will find that they know very little about how to implement their least used mode, for example. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the 4th and the 5th insights that I'm going to mention involve collaboration as a special mode that deserves special attention. So I'm going to talk about team building, skill building and collaboration in a couple of contexts, one for individuals and one for teams. And here's what you need to know. While all 5 conflict modes are useful tools in different situations, research is clear that successful collaboration results in better outcomes, namely superior decisions, learning, innovation, trust building, higher satisfaction with conflict outcomes. A lot of research that shows that. Of course, it also takes more time often and so on. And so when we're talking about building collaborative skills, and so we're not saying using them indiscriminately, but using them on very important kinds of issues. So we want to make sure that individuals have collaborative skills in their toolkit, and that teams also are able to build collaborative capacity when they're faced with very important issues. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to start with individual skills, the ones that I deal with when I do workshops. The first one involves knowing the difference between concerns and positions. Okay, so a concern is the thing you care about in a conflict, the thing that's threatened that you'd like to protect. Remember we said earlier on that conflict occurs when two people's concerns appear to be incompatible. Okay, concern is the thing they care about. A position, on the other hand, is an action that somebody proposes to settle the conflict. Here's what we should do. Okay. Now, here's the problem. If you stay talking at the level of positions, we should do this. No, we should do that. No, we shouldn't do that. You can't get to win-win. I mean, it's just logically impossible. So you need to get below positions to concerns. I'm going to give you an example that will hopefully make the point. So assume you're a chief financial officer in a firm, and a department head tells you that she wants to spend funds for a party to celebrate an extremely successful project. And she has a right to celebrate because they've done a great job, made a lot of money for the company, settled under time, the customer is delighted, and so on. At the same time, as a chief financial officer, you realize that it would be very difficult, maybe impossible, to finance a party that involves booze and spouses and so on with that particular pot of money because it's a government program and they audit for things like that. So what do? If you stay talking at the level of positions, she says, I want to do the party, I want to have the party. Then you're limited with saying no, right? You compete, you say no. Or accommodating, maybe losing your job, but you're saying, okay, I guess you can do it. It's long, but you can do it. Or reaching some kind of a compromise. Can you have a little booze, and only some wines or something like that. So to get to a win-win solution, to collaborate, you need to get away from positions. Most conflicts, after all, seem to be arguments over positions, right? Get below that to the level of concerns. Next slide. Okay. So the two essential steps in collaborating are identifying your own concern and the other person's concern. Sometimes I call them the underlying concerns. And then invite the other person to problem solve to find creative ways of meeting both concerns. So an example, you say, well, look, why do you need this party? Well, I want to give recognition to these people who really earn it. Okay. What's your concern? Well, my concern is this is government money. They won't allow a party. Okay. So then you phrase it as a mutual problem. Is there a way that we can provide recognition for your team, because God knows they deserve it, in a way that doesn't violate the rules, the accounting rules for this pot of money? Oh. Okay, and then people problem solve and try to find it. And let's say they come up with an idea of, well, maybe we could have just a special meeting. Where we hand out plaques and maybe even videotapes on how well we've done and so on. But we don't serve booze, or if at least we do, we bring it with our own money. That's really fine. That'll work, right? So it's an example of problem solving that starts by identifying underlying concerns and then, doing some creative problem solving. Okay, next. All right. And here's the third skill. What do you do when you're trying to be collaborative if the other person is pushing their position hard, trying to steamroller you? Most people understand that in that situation you need to be firm or you'll get rolled over. On the other hand, there's so often some confusion, especially in the heat of the moment, about what you need to be firm about. And what the research shows is clearly that you need to be firm about your concern, but that you can be flexible about the position. So what will typically happen is, let's say the department head is, I want to have the party. Look, I want to have the party. My people need it. They deserve it. So you issue a strong statement insisting on your concern. My concern about that is it would violate rules. It might get me fired. it might get the organization in trouble. They might lose future contracts, federal contracts, and so on. So there's no way I'm going to allow a party, but I'm open to finding other ways that we can recognize your people. So, and it's called firm flexibility. It's kind of an enchanting oxymoron, but it tells you what it's important to be firm about when that happens. And in fact, there is another line of research that shows that when that happens in conversations, people are more likely to be satisfied with the outcome. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the action step 4 here, have people practice key collaborative skills. I listed the 3 that I use in my workshops. Give people the skills in identifying the underlying concerns in a conflict, have them pose the issue as a mutual problem, use firm flexibility when required, have them practice that. And as a tip, what I'll often do, especially if it's a new kind of organization I'm not familiar with, I'll have participants write short cases on a recent conflict that they had before the workshop, send it in. I'll select some cases with the writer's permission, making sure that it's not going to embarrass anybody in the room. And then we'll role play collaborative skills in relation to that case. And having them do that also gives me a pretty good idea of the kinds of issues that they're struggling with. So I've got some background and so on. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we're jumping from collaborative skills for individuals to building collaborative capacity in teams. Again, teams don't want to use collaboration all the time, but on especially important issues involving vital kind of team concerns, you want to get those superior decisions and so on. And so here's some points or insights related to that. Teams also have conflict styles based on the dominant styles of their members and leader. And in fact, in the Introduction to Conflict in Teams booklet, there's a worksheet to help you identify your team style. And different team styles create unique challenges for creating collaborative capacity. In competing groups, for example, the arguments get in the way and so on. I'm going to show you an example of an accommodating team in a moment. They have very different kind of challenges. So teams with different team styles require different strategies for building collaborative capacity. There's not one thing you do to a group to ensure that it has collaborative capacity. You have to start with where it is, because how you get there depends on where you start. Okay, next slide. So here's a board of directors that I worked with that had an accommodating style. And you'll notice that this is the count of people who scored highest on each of the conflict handling modes. You notice that more people scored highest on accommodating than anything else, and also that very few people, and here's a chart in the same group of their least used modes, and you can see that 4 people had collaborating as their least used mode, and nobody had accommodating as their least used mode. So that overall, people used accommodating a lot more than collaborating. And this was a group that was fun to be in. It was like a family. They treated each other like friends. Nobody rocked the boat. They were glad to see each other. They're very gentle with each other, and so on. People liked coming to the meetings. Next slide. But those same kind of characteristics created challenges for collaborating on important issues. And 3 of them are listed as partial listing, and there are more of them in the Conflict in Teams booklet. So here's some common challenges then for accommodator groups. People have difficulty asserting their needs. So what we did was worked with the chairman of the board and came up with remedies to address each of those challenges. So he would poll members ahead of their meeting for their particular needs or interests or ideas or concerns about things they would like to take care of in the next meeting. and they have that on record. Another challenge is conformity. People have the notion that they are most loyal to the group when they don't rock the boat and accept the group's assumptions. And what the chairman was able to do was to assure people that people would be most loyal to the group when they kept the group from making stupid mistakes, basically. So he encouraged norms of critical thinking to make sure that we're not doing the wrong thing, that there may be better ways of doing it, and so on. I want you to, look for those possibilities and certainly to bring them to our attention. The last challenge here was that, I want to go back, Laura. Okay. The last challenge was that people were reluctant to debate or challenge other people's views. So even if you thought there were problems with what somebody was saying, it would be very difficult to challenge them because it would feel like you were offending them, and this was a close-knit group. So what the chairman did was use structure debates or devil's advocates. That would create a role in the group in charge of looking for problems and challenging any proposal that got made, but it wasn't taken personally, so it didn't look like the kind of personal attack that would be taboo in an accommodating group. And basically, as it happened, that group did very well following that intervention. Okay, next. So this last action step then involves using introduction to conflict in teams to have teams identify their team conflict style, identify the challenges that style has for reaching collaborative decisions, and strategies that they can use to deal with those challenges so that they have collaborative capacity on important issues. And the practitioner tip is to use conflict in teams because it contains more detailed information on those issues. It's got a worksheet for individuals to use to identify their team style, and it's got separate pages on the strengths and challenges for each team type. And that was a quick run through 5 insights and action steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. We just want to leave you with a few closing thoughts here. Hopefully we've given you some useful tips today on stress and conflict situations. The MBTI does look at the MBTI assessment, looks at personality dynamics. It is dynamic with 4 levels, and the TKI assessment provides insights of what to do to navigate conflict. We're also offering today, as a thank you, a 10% discount on the products that both Michael and Ken talked about today. So if you want to go online or call us on the 800 number, please be sure to use our promotional code RESILIENT, and our offer goes through July 15th. So now we're going to go to questions and answers. And I have a question for Michael. If working with a team, how would you go about creating a stress workshop or conveying in the grip concepts with a group?
Good question. Well, I think a lot of what I'm would want to focus on is, again, going back to dominant function and inferior function. And often what we know about stress, for example, when I work with teams, it's often dealing with issues around change. And I know what happens when people implement changes, they don't take into account people's dominant function, where they prefer to work. So, for example, if you happen to have an ISFJ and an ISTJ on a team, the dominant function is introverted sensing. And so if you implement change that's going to cause them stress by not looking at what have you done in the past, then they're likely not going to go along with that change. Or if they do, they're going to resist it. They're not going to be as engaged in it. So what I would think about right off the bat, each dominant function, what do they need? For introverted sensing, you need to think about looking at what you've done in the past and let them see that, and so that they can be more comfortable with that change. And again, just like I shared earlier today, it's going to be different depending on that person's dominant function. Quick answer, but hopefully that was helpful.
Good. Thank you, Michael. Ken, I have a question for you next. Can you please tell us about any research regarding collaboration and its effectiveness for the results that it gets.
Yeah, there's a conflict literature that is full of those kinds of studies. I would have to say, well, if you send your question to me, I think we're going to have my URL on the next slide. I'd be happy to get back in touch with you and to point you to some of those things, those publications. But there are a lot of them. It's pretty universal finding.
Okay, thank you. We have another question for Michael. And Michael, can you please address the role of the tertiary function during stress? What about the role of the auxiliary?
The tertiary and the auxiliary. I know we're probably using words for people new to science that they're wondering what do those words mean. It almost sounds like another language. But when we talk about the tertiary function, it's really our third function. So we talked about the dominant function. That's our first function, the one we use the most. The auxiliary function, I think I mentioned it once. That's our second favorite, and it really supports and balances the dominant function. The tertiary function is our third favorite, and the inferior, when we're in the grip, that's our fourth favorite. The tertiary is interesting because it's also unconscious. Also, it's sort of an area that is not as comfortable for us to use. There's a debate going on, though, in the type community about what the attitude of that function should be. Should it be opposite the dominant function, or should it be the same as the dominant function? I know it's getting complicated, but if you take a look at Introduction to Type Dynamics and Development, an excellent resource, you can read more information about the tertiary. Basically, you'll find information also in the MBTI manual. It's defined for you on page 231 in the manual. You'll also see information in the booklet In the Grip on page 5. There's a good definition there. About the auxiliary, really quick, I mentioned that it balances and supports the dominant function. By that, what it means is if your dominant function is extroverted, your auxiliary function is going to be introverted. So it balances your dominant function in that it shows that every one of us, everybody on the phone, everybody here listening on the phone, we have a part of us that we extrovert and a part that we introvert because our dominant function and our auxiliary function are opposite.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Ken, real quick, I have a question here from somebody who says, we do not currently use assessments in our organization, but we'd like to start using the TKI. Can you give us, real quick, 1 or 2 tips for getting started with using it in our organization?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do would be to get get some copies of the instrument. You can either use the online format or booklets and so on. And I would get a couple of the support booklets, and I would look at look through them, maybe talk to a consultant that uses them, maybe have them do a workshop for your group. I mean, if you're, for example, in an HR department, have them come in and do a basic workshop for you. There's also a kind of a facilitator's guide that you can get and look at. That'll give you how to do a basic workshop using it and so on. And I think what you'll want to take it and fill it out yourself too, I think, and have some fun with looking at the implications of it. That's about all I can think of off the top of my head. But again, write to me if you've got some more kind of specific questions that I can help you with.
Yeah, we'll show your contact information, both Ken and Michael's, on the last slide in just a moment. We have one last question. Michael, in 30 seconds, if you could address the relationship between the MBTI type preferences and the conflict modes.
I have actually lots of data to share, but I know we don't have lots of time. For people who want to take a look, go to www.cpp.com/MBTI validity. So www.cpp.com/MBTI validity, and you'll see information about the TKI modes and MBTI step 1, and even step 2. You'll see information about the path.
Very good. We've come to the end of today's webinar. I know that we have many questions that we were not able to respond to individually. We will be sending your questions, your unanswered questions, to both Michael and or Ken, and hopefully they'll respond to you. We want to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially to Michael and Ken for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. Today's presentation was part of CPP's 2011 webinar series on organizational development, thought leadership, and actionable steps. Look for a communication to come from us soon with additional resources on conflict and stress. Our next thought webinar on August 18th will focus on creating powerful people by cultivating trust and increasing influence through behavioral-based coaching. I hope you'll join us again, and goodbye for now.